Here in the United States, if you turn on the news right now, the story sounds the same. It's a military escalation, strategic strikes, or regional tensions. But last night, I started watching coverage from outside the Western media bubble, specifically on Arabic language broadcasts, and the tone was completely different. And not just slightly different, I mean completely different. So I translated the parts of the broadcast, to understand what, their audience was actually hearing from their media. And what they're being told sounds much closer to the beginning of like a massive regional war than just some limited military conflict. One broadcast had opened up with a dramatic description of the night across the Middle East. The host had described the skies over multiple capitals glowing orange with fire. He mentioned Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Beirut and Lebanon in the same breath, saying the entire region was experiencing what he called a night of reckoning. Now, according to that broadcast, waves of Iranian missiles had already crossed into Israeli airspace and forcing millions of civilians into underground shelters. Explosions were reportedly being heard in industrial areas around Tel Aviv, while ambulances had moved through the city, and the city was pretty much empty, just no people. The broadcast had described collapsing buildings, smoke, cities were silent, just the ambulance sirens. But what had stood out wasn't just the imagery to me, it was the framing. Because the broadcast wasn't describing this as a contained exchange, it was describing something a lot bigger. The same broadcast had then shifted into focus to Iran. So, specifically to images that were supposedly coming from an oil refinery that was in South Tehran. The host had claimed that Israeli and American missiles had struck the refinery, causing a massive toxic cloud to rise over that area. So, viewers were told that residents were being warned not to leave their homes because, according to the report, there was death in the air. And again, whether that description reflects reality or not isn't the actual point. The point is how the event is actually being presented to the viewers. Because the broadcast had framed the strike not just as military action, but as something closer to what it called chemical warfare. And that's a very serious accusation. And it shows how differently this conflict can be portrayed depending on who is actually telling you the story. So that brings me to this technological narrative here. It's another part of that broadcast where they focused on new missile technology. Because the host had claimed that Iran had deployed an upgraded missile capability of splitting into dozens of separate fragments while in the air. Basically, not carpet bombing, but cluster bombs. And according to that report, a single missile could release dozens of smaller targets, overwhelming Israeli air defenses. And I know people have seen that. But the broadcast suggested that Israeli defense systems like the Iron Dome were struggling to actually stop these attacks. Now, again, whether that description is accurate or exaggerated isn't the point of this video. What matters is the narrative. Because to the audience watching that broadcast, the message is clear. Their side is gaining the upper hand, and technologically. So that brings me to my next point, the global war narrative. Because the most dramatic claim came later in the broadcast. An Iranian political figure had quoted suggesting that American military personnel had been captured in neighboring countries. The host had implied that if this were true, the conflict would no longer be regional. It would become something much larger. At one point, the broadcast even suggested that the world might be witnessing the beginning of a third world war. Now, if you compare that language with the tone you typically hear in Western media, in most Western media, the emphasis is on strategic calculations, political consequences, and military capabilities. But in this broadcast, the emphasis was existential, basically total war or regional collapse, civilizations colliding. That's two completely different tones describing the same exact situation. The psychological difference, and I want to kind of get into this and break this down. This is something people often underestimate. News isn't just information, it's also interpretation. And the way an event is framed can completely change how people understand what's actually happening. In one country, viewers might see a limited military exchange, but in another, they might believe they're watching the beginning of an historic war, something bigger. The facts might overlap, but the narrative surrounding those facts can be radically different, right? So, this is going to be the perspective shift. And this is something worth remembering whenever we follow global events. Because millions of people around the world are watching the same exact situation unfold. But the story they're hearing about it may be completely different depending on where they actually live in the world. Because they have different media systems, they have different political interests, they have different historical perspectives, all shaping the story in different ways, right? So, with that being said, when you hear about a major global event, it's worth asking yourself a simple question. What does this story sound like somewhere else? Because sometimes the biggest difference in a conflict isn't just what's happening on the ground. It's the reality that people believe they're living in.